Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 265 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. The FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group is a business advisory, information services, and technological firm that helps clients manage risk across 4 key areas. They include sales and sales channels, distributors, resellers, partners, and suppliers, customers, human capital consisting of employees and contractors. In this episode, I visit with Jared Connors. Jared is the manager of supply chain ecosystems for the Red Flag Group, and he and I start a multi-part podcast series about supply chain risk management. In this episode, we're going to do an introduction to a risk-based approach to supply chain risk management. I think you'll find it very interesting. Jared has a background in supply chain, and he is very passionate about working in and with supply chain. The episode comes in at just under 20 minutes. I think you will find it very, very enjoyable. I'd also like to announce that Jared and I are participating in a webinar on Thursday, July 14th on this topic, where we'll go into greater depth. So if you'd like to have more information on supply chain risk management, you can check out the webinar. You can find out more information by going to the Red Flag Group website, which is www.redflaggroup.com, and check out webinars. The webinar, of course, is free. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to getting your feedback and visiting with you further. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group, and I'm here today with Jared Connors. Jared is the Manager of Supplier Ecosystems for the Red Flag Group, and we are going to start a podcast series on supply chain risk management. Today's podcast will be the introduction to a risk-based approach that Jared's been working on. So, Jared, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. I look forward to this.
And I should also announce that on Thursday, July 14th, Jared and I will be participating in a Red Flag Group webinar where we explore some of these topics more in depth. But we wanted to give a kind of a teaser for this upcoming webinar. And in this particular webinar, we're going to identify 4 different key elements of a risk-based approach that Jared and his team have developed. So, Jared, could you tell us what you think are the 4 steps to building a quality risk management program for supply chain?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So, building a quality supply chain risk management program. So what we've done is we've come up with 4 key elements to understanding how to manage a quality program. Those are identify, collect, evaluate, and mitigate. So let me give you a little detail on those. Identify. We're trying to help companies with large supply chains go out and identify where the risks are in their supply chains and which suppliers represent the biggest potential for risk. I remember back in my days of working on supply chain risk programs, every single vendor that came in and talked to me about their solution always had a one-size-fits-all program. And that clearly doesn't work because you in a procurement situation don't utilize every supplier in the same way. So why should your risk management program treat each supplier in the same light? So what we're trying to do is help you understand where those risks are, which suppliers have the biggest potential for risk, and then how to address those issues. So now we get into collect. Collect is really important because we need to involve the suppliers in this process. I can't stress that enough, the importance of involving the suppliers in that process. I come from an electronics background, and in my days of supply chain risk over the last decade, we'd have association meetings where several of us in electronics would get together and we would talk about our approach to addressing supply chain issues. And one of the biggest or most common ways that people would start to address supply chain issues is just throw every single supplier to on-site audit. We all know that can be very costly and sometimes not all that effective. So my approach was always to involve the suppliers, gather information from the suppliers and on the suppliers, to then approach them with a conversation and explain the why message. What's important to you and your business that the supplier may need to change with their business practice or up-level in order to reduce or minimize the risk to your company. Now we talk about evaluate. Well, it's important now that you've collected all this information, you have to understand what that data is telling you. And it's not just about saying what those risks are, but it's important to understand what that potential for impact to your business is, because there are some risks out there that you may identify from a supplier that may not necessarily impact your business based on your relationship with the supplier, how you utilize the supplier and products. There are many different ways to understanding what the potential is for the risk to impact your business. And we'll get into that in more detail as we go through our webinar series coming forward. Now finally, we get to mitigate. Now I like to call this all roads lead to corrective action. And what I mean by that is, again, my involvement of the suppliers in the process. Because if you're in a procurement role, I'm sure at some point in your career you've had somebody like me in a CSR position come up to you and say, well, we need to stop doing business with this supplier because we have environmental concerns about this supplier, or whatever the case may be. And if you're in a procurement person or a procurement role, excuse me, your reaction was probably the same as what I received, which was typically laughter to say, well, I need this supplier, this is important, so I need you to work with them. And that's why I think it's so important to say that all roads lead to corrective action. What can you do with this supplier to help alleviate that risk to your business? And again, that goes back to my piece on explaining the why message, involving the suppliers to help alleviate or minimize that risk to your firm. So Tom, there's the intro to the 4 key areas of risk management program for supply chain.
You know, Jared, if I could turn now to some of the general company issues that you have seen give companies difficulty in supply chain risk management, and then maybe describe drill down a little bit into the internal and external issues that you've seen. But could you start off with some of the larger or bigger issues that you've seen really across industries?
Sure. The first and most prevalent issue, I think, when it comes to supply chain risk is lack of understanding. Now, some of you, like me, have traveled all over to conferences to learn about these impacts and what they can do to you. But the problem is that if you don't have the dedicated resources within your organization, it's really hard to maintain the bench strength to keep up with the constant changes of regulatory and reputational risk issues that can happen from the supply chain. And also what happens is another big general issue is when you talk internally within your organizations, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, others in your organization or senior leadership sometimes doesn't see the connection between the supplier issue and the business impact. So it's really important to be able to explain that internally as much as it is to be able to say that externally. And here's an example of what I mean by that. We all know stories in the past of retail organizations that have struggled with environmental concerns or labor issues with Southeast Asian suppliers. And if you notice the trend in a lot of those articles, those suppliers themselves that are causing these issues are typically never named in those media articles, but their customers are always the ones that are on the front lines of those articles. And so I think that's a really easy way to understanding the impact, because you've got to understand the behavior of those that are monitoring these issues out there in the market. Also, it's pretty well known in the procurement world, or at least in my experience, that it's sometimes very difficult for people to grasp how they can comprehend making the supplier make a difference. How can I get this supplier to change when my supplier tells me to go pound sand so often? Well, again, I think that's explaining the why message. And here's a really good example from my past working on conflict minerals. I'm sure some of you have worked on this regulation, understand this example when a supplier says, I can't give you that information because that information is proprietary. Well, my response used to be very simple. It was always the same. If you can tell me what's proprietary about a tin ingot, I'll stop asking you this question. And as soon as I started to then explain why this was important to me, at the same time explaining what I wasn't going to ask for, I got much more dialogue with my suppliers to understand, because sometimes there's little comprehension, even from the suppliers, of how they can make a difference for what you're asking for. So you got to get into the detail a little bit with the supplier. So if we move on to Tom's next piece, which was to talk about some of the internal or some of the more specific internal or external factors that are impacting people's abilities to then address these general risks, I'll talk about what I call the internal risk piece, which is the multiple groups within an organization are all handling the same piece. And what I mean by that is, if you have somebody from an EHS organization that's communicating environmental concerns, or health and safety concerns to a supplier. Then you have CSR that's looking at more reputational pieces such as labor rights. And then you've got procurement looking at more business risks, cost, availability, and legal talking about maybe regulatory risks. What can happen is you can overwhelm the suppliers with this information, and sometimes your program tends to fall apart in that instance. So these are some of the internal risks where people, I would say, not necessarily a risk, but more of a barrier to entry. When people say, well, it's very hard for me to go in and start creating a program. I feel like I have this barrier to entry with the amount of touch that's going on around my business. How do I get a handle on that? If we go on to external factors, we look at lack of transparency as a big issue. And conflict minerals and anti-human trafficking are really good, very simplistic, very easy to understand examples of lack of transparency, because I would argue that conflict minerals isn't necessarily about verifying sources for tin, tantalum, tungsten, or gold, and it's more about verifying transparency or the ability to gather information from your supply chain. And so sometimes people come up to those issues and they say, well, there's no way I'm going to be able to get this information throughout my supply chain in order to then verify it. If I have such a struggle to even cover things like form, fit, and function with my supplier from a procurement standpoint, how am I going to then go and get all the transparency of this information? And so what I'm suggesting is that you look at the idea of different risk management models. And so when I talk about risk management models, I've already addressed these a little bit. I'm talking about a decentralized versus a centralized risk management model. And I would imagine that a lot of companies out there have tried on either one of these pieces or these elements to risk management. And if I think about decentralized for just a second here, decentralized is when you have multiple people owning different aspects of the risk management process, like I had suggested before, where you've got CSR working on one element, and you've got, say, legal working on another element, maybe regulatory piece. This really can create a lot of difficulty with the supplier, and in my experience, the suppliers often come back and say, gosh, I've got 14 people talking to me about this, and there's about 20% overlap in between each, and I'm spending a lot of ergs working on these pieces, so if you guys combine this into one element, or one conversation once a year through your annual process, it might make it a lot easier on me. So that's when a lot of companies will think about a centralized model. I'm going to have a single group own my risk management process with my supply chain, and I'm going to allow procurement to quote, focus on their day job, if you will. That's the gathering the materials from supply chain. And I'm going to have, say, my CSR team own this. And that's a good program as well, but at the same time, what happens is sometimes you have disparity between your procurement organization and your CSR groups. And what happens is that if you're not keeping up with your procurement organization, you might not have all the information on a particular supplier. I can remember one instance in the past where I spent a lot of time working with a supplier on corrective actions and even sent them to audit, only to find out that they were going end of life in less than 7 months. So there I was spending all this time and effort, and if I had involved the procurement organization in that process, I would have been a little bit more clear on where to focus my time and energy.
Well, Jared, if I could stop you there a minute, because you've articulated both a centralized and decentralized approach to supply chain risk management, and you've really laid out the strengths and weaknesses of both. Is there a different model that you might suggest companies take a look at?
Absolutely. And so that's where I get to the hybrid model approach. And what I mean by that is, very simply, exercise the core competencies of each group internally. Procurement, their focus is suppliers. They understand the supplier, they own the relationships to the supplier, they can tell you how the business is utilizing the supplier. Take advantage of that, involve them in your program. CSR, they own the code of conduct typically. They're very good at understanding how these risks can impact your company. Along with corporate affairs, I kind of somewhat put CSR and corporate affairs organizations together in a very close communication piece, because corporate affairs they're responsible for communicating externally and also learning about what communications or what things are coming down the turnpike that impact the business. So what I'm suggesting is a hybrid model where you take advantage of the core competencies of each one of these organizations to ensure that they all have the information. But this also requires that companies commit to having a committee or a group that meets on a regular basis to discuss what's going to happen next with the supply chain risk assessment, or what roadblocks they're running into, in order for each one of these groups to then communicate how they might be able to help in that organization. So here's an example that I have for that. If you are involving corporate affairs, CSR, and procurement all in one conversation, what happens is that they're able to tell you point blank what's the best approach forward given their area of expertise. So in the past, I worked on conflict minerals, I've worked on the various product regulations. And my approach when I was looking at a centralized model was that we own this responsibility of going out and gathering these regulatory requirements from suppliers. And we looked at our SAP solution and we said, gosh, we have 10,000 plus suppliers in here. How are we going to approach this? What are we going to do? We're going to have to survey 10,000 plus suppliers. And so we kind of set a timeout and we started talking to our procurement organizations internally. And we learned from our procurement organization that even though there might be 10,000 plus suppliers in our SAP solution, we really boil it down to current active builds and the suppliers even within the AMLs that are actually supporting those builds, because we all know that alternatives are typically listed in bills of materials. We boiled it down to less than 700 suppliers. And therefore we had this very approachable program to go out and say, you know what, this is something we can wrap our hands around. And that was because what we did was we presented to procurement and said, here's what our approach suggestion is, and they said, well, let us go away and give you feedback on that, utilizing what we know best about the supply chain.
So, Jared, unfortunately, I think we're getting near the end of our time, so I think I'm going to save the 4-step process for a subsequent podcast, but I was wondering if you had any really final thoughts about how a supply chain professional might define their risk management program or even think through developing a manageable approach.
Sure, yeah. So here I am preaching about all these great things that you can do to potentially minimize risk or understand or get these internal organizations together in one group to say we need to solve these problems. But everything's always easier than said than done. And while it's great to go out and build this best-in-class program, every program needs to be tailored to the individual business, whether it be your risk tolerance, the way you interact with suppliers. Some people only use contract manufacturing versus direct manufacturing processes, so maybe that's a different approach for them for supply chain risk management. And so what I'm suggesting in order to develop a manageable approach that's right for your organization is, one, you need to get to know your suppliers' practices. You need to understand how you're using those suppliers, how the procurement organization gathers materials from them. Is it direct? Is it indirect? Who's in the right? Who's in the current builds? And then the next piece is to ask the right questions. I'd already talked about the pushback I got in the conflict minerals days when I worked on that, and how easy it was for me to dismiss that conversation simply by explaining to the supplier, taking the time to explain, here's what I'm asking for, not asking for, and how you're, as a supplier, in the same situation as me. We're in an information gathering position. It's also really important to go out and collect and aggregate data and then analyze that data to understand how or when it could impact your organization. And then, as always, with any risk management program, it's important to trust but verify. So we need to go out and we need to get the suppliers to prove that they're adhering to particular policies. It's one thing to have an anti-human trafficking policy. It's another one to track your performance to your own policy. What are you doing internally to ensure that you're in compliance with that policy? And all those boil around one piece, and that's communicate. So communicate with your suppliers, involve the suppliers, and most importantly, communicate internally. Why this is important to your organization, how it can impact your organization, and what stakeholders do you need from within the organization to make this work.
Well, Jared, I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with me on this, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. As I indicated when I introduced the episode, Jared and I are going to be visiting greater and more at length on a webinar on the supply chain risk management, which will be held on Thursday, July 14th at noon. I hope you can join us for the webinar. We're really going to get into a lot more detail and have a great slide deck for you if you sign up. You can register for no cost at the Red Flag Group website, which is www.redflaggroup.com, and check on the webinars tab. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to visiting with you again.